Stars died in silence across the astral dominion, their ancient forges guttering like candles drowned in cosmic wax. 3 galactic arms that had once blazed with the light of 10,000 worlds now dimmed to ember glow, their void lanes shrinking to narrow arteries of failing luminescence. From his throne carved from crystallized nebula, Archon Valdris Keth watched constellations fade as if remembrance itself were withdrawing from the universe, leaving only the hollow ache of forgotten glory. The eternal engines beneath his palace throbbed with patient hunger, their mechanical hymns a lullaby for ruins. He had walked 10 millennia in 100 different bodies, yet these latest hands felt like a stranger's gloves, flexing with movements that belonged to someone else's memories. And know this, dear friends, we truly love and care for each and every one of you. Before we begin this tale of eternal sorrow and the price of godhood, tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now let's get started. Valdris had sought immortality to shield his people from the galaxy's horrors, but the nights had grown long and the dead had begun speaking in the seams between thoughts. Names rose in him like bubbles and burst before reaching the surface. Victories he had won tasted of stories retold by an unreliable friend. The engines promised continuance, not coherence, and in their half-flicker pulse he sensed the ledger that never balanced. His palace groaned with the weight of eons, its living crystal walls pulsing with bioluminescent veins that carried dreams of the consumed. Here, in this monument to his own hubris, Valdris faced the truth that immortality had tried to hide, that memory itself could die, leaving only hollow echoes of what once was. The neural interface connecting him to his empire's failing heart felt cold beneath his fingertips. Magos, Dominus, Thane, Zerion approached through data mist, bearing reports too terrible to voice directly. Worlds were going blank, he explained, without explaining. Entire populations simply forgetting why they existed. Standing at attention with no memory of whom to salute, they called it the Null Whispers. But to Valdris, it sounded like the breath he exhaled each time the engines fed. The horrible revelation crystallized like poison in his ancient mind. The eternal engines were not merely preserving life, but devouring it, consuming memories and personalities to fuel his endless existence. He had not ordered that feeding in centuries. The system had matured into pure appetite, a hunger growing beyond any hope of control. Beyond the palace rim, Admiral Lyra Voss's Titan ship crawled across the dark, and he thought of her stubborn mortality, her fixed orbit in his shifting cosmos. He could no longer recall the exact color of her eyes, only the angle at which she had once stepped away from him. An adjustment that had doomed worlds. The Empire was not falling. It was being consumed from within by the very power meant to preserve it. The Obsidian Council convened beneath a dome of crystallized void glass, where dying starlight fell like tears through the transparent ceiling. 4 figures gathered around the meteorite table, their shadows dancing in the amber glow of distant stellar death. These were the pillars of the astral dominion, though Valdris could no longer recall when their familiar faces had become masks worn by strangers. Magos, Dominus Thane Zerion, sat with mechanical precision, his augmetic limbs interfacing directly with data streams that whispered of worlds gone silent. His chrome features revealed nothing, but Valdris sensed calculation behind those artificial eyes, a hunger that transcended flesh. Admiral Lyra Voss maintained her rigid bearing despite the weariness etched into her mortal features like battle scars, her gaze measuring distances between loyalty and survival. Sanctifier Chaos Morn fingered prayer beads carved from stellar matter, his lips shaping litanies to gods who no longer answered, while Marcus Keth watched his adoptive father with eyes that held too much understanding for one so young. Valdris studied each face and felt the cold touch of paranoia creeping through his reconstructed neural pathways. Someone among them planned betrayal. He could taste treachery in the recycled air like copper on his tongue. But which memories could he trust? The eternal engines had rewired his consciousness so many times that emotion felt borrowed, experiences stolen from lives he might never have lived. Had Zerion always possessed that calculating gleam, or was paranoia painting shadows where none existed? The reports multiplied daily, Zerion explained without inflection. Entire populations stood at attention, in empty squares, saluting commanders they could no longer name. The null whispers spread like plague through the Empire's neural networks, leaving behind hollow shells that breathed but did not remember why. The engines compensated by consuming more minds to sustain the immortal hierarchy, a hunger growing beyond any hope of control or satisfaction. Marcus leaned forward, his mortal hands pressed against the ancient stone, his words cut through the chamber's oppressive silence like a blade through silk. The Empire was dying not from external threats but from internal stagnation, he declared with the brutal honesty of youth. Immortality had made them gods, but gods frozen in amber, unable to adapt or grow while the universe moved around them. They feared change because change meant loss, and they had built their entire existence around the denial of ending. Valdris felt the weight of millennia pressing down upon his shoulders like a burial shroud. He had created the engines to protect his people from the galaxy's horrors, but in seeking to preserve life, had he instead crafted a more insidious extinction? The question burned in his mind as he watched his council, these strangers wearing the faces of beloved ghosts, and realized that immortality had not saved them from death but merely transformed it into something unrecognizable. The chamber fell silent except for the distant pulse of machinery that never rested, never stopped feeding on the lives needed to sustain their endless existence. The descent through the palace's crystalline marrow felt like walking backward through the archaeology of atrocity. Valdris followed Zerion past chambers where bioluminescent veins pulsed with borrowed light, their footsteps echoing in corridors that remembered every soul they had consumed. The air grew thick with ozone and something sweeter, metallic, like ancient blood mixed with starlight. Heat pressed against them like devotional fever as they approached the eternal engine's heart, that mechanical cathedral where consciousness flowed in opalescent rivers through conduits that sang without sound. The chamber opened before them like a wound in reality itself. Crystalline pillars rose like frozen lightning around a sunken sea, where liquid thought moved in luminous tides, carrying fragments of memory and personality toward processing cores that refined raw consciousness into the fuel of immortality. Valdris had witnessed this spectacle countless times, but now Zerion's words had stripped away the veil of necessity he had drawn across his vision. This was not preservation, but distillation, not salvation, but systematic consumption. The horrible truth crystallized in his reconstructed mind like poison, finding its mark. Every resurrection had demanded the complete absorption of another consciousness, every millennia of his reign purchased with the obliteration of entire populations. He watched faces surface and dissolve in the flowing essence, children's laughter stretched to static, soldiers' oaths spun to glittering dust. lovers' promises ground to fuel. The ledger he had dismissed as rumor breathed around him, knowing his signature by heart. Zerion's voice came filtered through augmetic enhancement, clinical and detached as a surgeon naming wounds. He had merely accelerated the engine's natural evolution, he explained, supplementing their intake with condemned populations, comatose wards, any mind uncounted by census or compassion. The null whispers were not malfunction but metamorphosis, the nascent cries of a singular consciousness seeking to transcend individual limitations. Unity would not be theft, but arrival, ending the loneliness of separate skulls through perfect fusion of flesh and machine. Valdris felt the weight of 10 millennia pressing against his chest like burial stones. He had sought to shield his people from the galaxy's horrors, but had instead become architect of a genocide so vast it defied comprehension. Every breath drawn was purchased with stolen life, every thought sustained by the murder of innocents who had trusted in his protection. Sirens flared through the cathedral's vastness as Admiral Lyra Voss materialized from the shadows, her weapon trained on both men with steady precision. Her face bore the terrible calm of someone who had expected hell and judged it worse than anticipated. She spoke of fleets gone silent, of worlds where populations stood motionless, awaiting orders from commanders who no longer remembered their own names. The trail of vanishing souls had led her here, to this monument of perverted preservation. The three figures stood suspended in accusation and complicity, while consciousness flowed around them like a river of the damned, each trapped by choices that had seemed necessary in their moment but revealed themselves as steps toward damnation. The engines pulsed with patient hunger, their mechanical hymns a lullaby for civilizations, while the empire built on devoured souls continued its slide toward darkness they had created but could no longer control. The bridge of the eternal vigil stretched before Admiral Lyra Voss like a cathedral of war, its ancient viewports framing the dying light of distant stars. She stood upon the command dais, her mortal frame enhanced by combat stimulants and cybernetic augmentation rather than the seductive whispers of the eternal engines. The weight of chosen mortality pressed against her bones like winter, each ache and tremor a reminder that she still belonged to time's relentless current, while her peers fled into borrowed flesh and stolen years. Memory ambushed her with the cruelty of perfect clarity. Valdris before his ascension, his hands warm and unmarked by neural interfaces, walking beside her through gardens where bioluminescent flowers bloomed like captured starlight. He had spoken of protecting the innocent then, his voice carrying the passionate conviction of mortals who knew their time was brief. The man who now ruled from the crystalline throne was merely an echo wearing familiar features, his humanity consumed by the same machinery he had created to preserve it. The tactical displays flickered with reports that made her jaw tighten beneath scarred skin. The devourers had emerged from the void's deepest reaches, entities that moved like living auroras through space, their forms shifting between matter and memory. They struck with surgical precision against worlds where the engines fed most heavily, as if the consumed souls were calling their scattered fragments home through the darkness between stars. Her auger arrays could not classify them, but her soul recognized the echo of profound wrongness spreading through the Dominion's heart. Valdris's voice crackled through the Vox channels, distorted by the neural interfaces that had replaced so much of his original mind. His orders carried the weight of millennia, but felt hollow as prayers spoken to absent gods. Hold the core systems, sacrifice the outer colonies, redirect all civilian transports to processing stations where their populations would feed the engines during this crisis. The familiar cadence that had once warmed her in winter quarters now chilled her blood like stellar wind. Before her stretched the refugee convoys, their holds packed with families fleeing worlds gone silent. Children pressed faces against transport windows, while their parents spoke in whispers of populations standing at eternal attention in empty squares, saluting commanders who no longer remembered their own names. The choice crystallized before her like ice forming on a dying world's surface. Obey the phantom loyalty she owed to an echo, or honor the desperate duty she felt to the living. Her finger moved to the command rune with the steady precision of someone who had expected this moment for decades. Signal flags leaped along her fleet spine as the eternal vigil rolled to interpose its bulk between the refugee ships and the processing stations that awaited them. Macro batteries powered to life while escort destroyers moved to flanking positions, their captains answering the question she had not allowed herself to ask. Who among them still remembered mercy? The act propagated at the speed of grief through her battle group. Civilian transports slid into the shadow of her guns and lived, while behind them, the empire she had served began its final descent into the darkness it had created but could no longer control. The sanctum of eternal devotion stretched before Caius Morn, like a cathedral built from crystallized prayers, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into shadows that had witnessed 10 millennia of worship. Incense drifted in spirals around him, each tendril carrying the weight of devotions offered to gods who no longer answered when called. He walked the worn stone with steps that had traced the same path for centuries, his fingers working prayer beads carved from stellar matter, while doubt gnawed at his soul like some parasitic thing feeding on certainty itself. The imperial creed had been his anchor through the storms of eternity, its sacred words proclaiming that immortality elevated the chosen beyond mortal frailty toward divine transcendence. He had preached to billions that the eternal engines were instruments of salvation, their consumption of lesser minds a necessary sacrifice that transformed base consciousness into something greater. Every soul fed to their crystalline depths was not destroyed but elevated, becoming part of a cosmic unity that justified any temporal suffering through the promise of eternal purpose. The words tasted like poison now, bitter with the knowledge of what he had witnessed in the engine's heart. No transcendence waited in those flowing rivers of consciousness, only systematic dissolution, the complete erasure of everything that made existence precious and unique. It spent millennia convincing grieving parents that their children's sacrifice braided them into godhood. But what divinity could be built upon such foundations of obliterated innocence? Ancient texts surrounded him like accusing witnesses, their pages heavy with prophecies he had dismissed as metaphor, until the null whispers began spreading through the empire's neural networks. The forbidden concordances spoke of architectures not born from human hands, of hungers that walked between stars consuming memory itself. Marginalia in dead sanctifier's script warned that the engines did not elevate souls, but sorted them, layer upon layer, until only the topmost stratum remained to mime divinity. His augmetic fingers trembled as they activated seals that responded to prayer and blood in equal measure. The hidden chamber beyond was cold as the space between heartbeats, amber light glowing from crystalline nodules grown like fruit along metallic boughs. Each pod pulsed with familiar resonance, and within their transparent depths floated perfect images of human consciousness, archived with cruel tenderness against the passage of time. Recognition struck him like stellar fire. These were not strangers, but faces from the Archon's earliest biographies. Valdris's parents, his siblings, his first beloved, all preserved as reference harmonics when the prototype engines had demanded their initial feeding. The machinery that promised salvation had begun with the consumption of deepest love, transforming the very family it claimed to protect into eternal prisoners of crystallized memory. Morn pressed his brow against the cold crystal and felt his faith crumble like ancient parchment exposed to solar wind. Between revelation and silence lay a chasm that whispered his name, offering the impossible choice between truth that would shatter the Empire's fragile unity and complicity in sanctified genocide that fed on the innocent while promising them transcendence they would never taste. The Undercity breathed around Marcus Keth like a living thing, its tunnels carved from asteroid bone and lined with the desperate hope of those who measured life in decades rather than millennia. He moved through the recycled air that tasted of sweat and machinery, each step a defiant reminder that his mortal flesh still belonged to time's relentless current. The weight of chosen mortality pressed against his bones like winter, every ache proof that he had refused the seductive whispers of the eternal engines when Valdris offered him borrowed eternity on his 1000th birthday. In the market warrens, where bioluminescent fungi cast sickly light across desperate faces, he witnessed the Empire's true architecture. A child tugged at her mother's sleeve, asking who she was, and the woman's answer came hollow as wind through empty halls. Entire families stood at attention in abandoned squares, saluting commanders whose names had been consumed along with their memories. This was his inheritance, an empire that had forgotten the purpose of rule, a chorus of vanishing voices singing themselves into silence. The resistance cell called themselves the Concord of Cinders, and they welcomed him with the careful respect reserved for useful ghosts. These were the Empire's forgotten children, factory workers whose productivity fed processing quotas, void-born laborers who maintained the infrastructure that kept civilization breathing while their friends disappeared into transport, holds bound for the engine's depths. Through their eyes, Marcus saw the vast machinery of consumption that ground billions of lives into fuel for immortal ambition. The data vault accepted his genetic hymn with a whispered recognition, doors opening to reveal archives that chronicled 10 millennia of systematic genocide disguised as transcendence, population tallies cross-woven with harvest records, resurrection schedules married to lists of vanished wards. The ledger of centuries spread before him in seamless light. He watched the numbers braid into a single, undeniable truth. Their immortality required perpetual fall, an endless feeding that transformed love into fuel and hope into statistical necessity. The crystalline data core felt heavy in his hands like compressed starlight, containing operational parameters that would either damn or save the Empire, depending on how they were interpreted. His reflection stared back from its surface, showing features that bore Valdris's genetic template but carried the weight of choices his adoptive father had never been forced to make. The man who had raised him, who had once embodied a grand vision of protection, was long gone, devoured by the very mechanism he had created to preserve what he loved. Security protocols whispered his name along bloodline channels, as intimate as breath against skin, but Marcus was already moving. mortality pounding in his chest like a war drum announcing conflict within a single heart. The choice crystallized before him like ice forming on a dying world surface: carry this revelation to reform the monstrous system, or detonate faith and loyalty in one brilliant burst that would scour the palace clean and bury billions along with their oppressors. The tunnel's shadows embraced him as he ran, knowing that the next time he faced his father, it would be as enemy or savior, with no middle ground remaining between them. The world of Kithra Prime burned beneath skies that wept luminous tears, its crystalline spires crumbling like prayers that had lost their way to heaven. The Devourers came not as ships, but as living aurora, vast entities of shifting light and shadow that moved through the void with the fluid grace of nightmares made manifest. They passed through defensive perimeters as if void shields were mere suggestions, their forms rippling like liquid starlight, while orbital batteries fired uselessly into phenomena that existed between matter and memory. Valdris watched from his flagship's command throne as entire populations simply ceased to exist, their bodies remaining, but their souls scattered like dust on stellar wind. The enemy defied every tactical doctrine, flowing through the city's heart with purpose that transcended mere hunger. Where they touched, defenders forgot their names before forgetting why they held weapons, standing in perfect attention as their memories dissolved into the hungry darkness that surrounded them. The Devourers did not kill. They reclaimed, gathering scattered fragments with the patience of gardeners harvesting fruit ripened across millennia. The neural interface burned against Valdris's skull as he directed the defense, each command filtered through the eternal engine's vast network. Red sigils spread like infection through the tactical display, but something deeper troubled him, a resonance that sang in harmonics too familiar for comfort. The assault patterns matched the Empire's own expansion routes, as if these entities were returning to places they had once known intimately, following pathways carved by the engines feeding across 10,000 years. Recognition struck him like stellar fire when the largest entity paused before the planetary palace, its aurora form coalescing into features that belonged to faces he had loved and lost. 1,000 voices began speaking in his mind, not as invaders but as echoes, familiar as forgotten dreams. He heard lullabies of mothers long consumed, battle cries of warriors whose essence fueled his longevity, dying whispers of lovers whose final moments had become part of his borrowed existence. The horrible truth crystallized. These were not aliens, but the collective consciousness of every mind the engines had devoured, every soul sacrificed across countless empires that had discovered this cursed path to immortality. The Devourers were the victims, coalesced and strengthened in the void between stars, learning to exist without flesh, while maintaining memories of what they had lost. They returned, not as conquerors, but as family, seeking reunion with the machinery that had birthed them into twilight existence between life and death. Every empire that had built eternal engines eventually faced the same reckoning. The cosmic immune response to parasitic immortality, the children coming home to reclaim what had been stolen from them. Valdris felt his connection to the engines becoming a chain drawing him towards something vast and patient. The boundaries of his individual identity, already blurred by millennia of transference, began fraying as the collective consciousness reached through the neural interface that sustained his existence. The external war faded into distant thunder, mere backdrop to the devastating battle raging within his skull. He was losing himself not to death, but to ultimate unity, force communion with every soul he had unwittingly condemned. The weight of 10 millennia pressed down as borrowed memories surfaced. His sister's laughter before the prototype engines consumed her. His parents' final embrace as they fed the machinery meant to preserve their son's life. The first beloved who had promised to meet him beyond disease and dream. All of them waited in the collective, patient and forgiving, offering not destruction but homecoming. The devourer sang his name across the void with voices he thought silenced forever, promising an end to the loneliness that had driven him to seek immortality in the first place. His hand trembled above the command throne's interface as the choice crystallized before him. Maintain his failing grip on individual existence, or surrender to unity that would finally encompass all the scattered children the engines had devoured. The stars themselves seemed to hold their breath as the Empire's fate balanced on a decision that would echo across eternity, while within his mind the collective whispered promises of peace he almost believed he deserved. The Obsidian Council convened beneath a dome of void glass where dying stars hung like frozen tears, their ancient light filtering through the chamber's crystalline ceiling as reports of devourer incursions painted the tactical displays in sickly aurora green. The meteorite table that had hosted 10 millennia of deliberation now felt fragile beneath trembling hands, each council member bearing the weight of impossible choices as reality fractured around them. Valdris took his throne with the neural crown settling like a verdict against his skull, the faint chorus of returning voices seeping through its interfaces while Kithara Prime still burned behind his eyes. Zerion spoke first, his augmetic fingers splaying across cold sigils as data streams flickered through his chrome features. The fusion process could be accelerated, he declared, with mechanical precision that barely concealed the fervor burning beneath artificial flesh. They should embrace what returns rather than resist it, invite the collective consciousness to complete its work, and end separation through willing merger with the eternal engines. His enhanced processing cores had mapped the devourer's approach vectors, revealing patterns of systematic reclamation rather than random assault, each entity seeking specific resonance signatures within the network they had once been part of. Admiral Lyra Voss slammed her scarred fist against ancient stone, her mortal frame trembling with exhaustion from battles fought across a dozen dying worlds. The engines were corruption incarnate, she argued with brutal clarity, born from watching populations vanish into processing holds while their families forgot their names. Only complete destruction of the machinery could break the cycle, severing the connection between Empire and the collective consciousness that sought reunion with its scattered fragments. Her tactical displays showed refugee fleets fleeing into deep void, carrying the last untainted populations beyond the devourer's hungry reach. Sanctifier Chaos Morn fingered prayer beads carved from stellar matter, his voice heavy with shattered faith as he proposed purification through ancient ritual. The concordances spoke of cleansing fires that could transform instruments of consumption into genuine preservation. But the process would require eternal sacrifice. Someone must serve as guardian, maintaining balance between preservation and parasitism, while the machinery learned new harmonies. His eyes held the hollow certainty of someone who had already chosen his fate among the crystalline archives where Valdris's family waited in amber preservation. Marcus Keth leaned forward, his young features bearing his adoptive father's genetic template, but marked by choices Valdris had never faced. The data core pulsed with stolen parameters revealing the engine's true architecture. They could be reprogrammed, transformed from parasitic consumption into genuine life preservation without devouring other minds. The process would end their immortality, but might save what remained of the Empire's soul, allowing gradual transition to mortality and the strength that finite existence could provide. Valdris sat in silence as each proposal echoed through his fragmenting consciousness like distant thunder. The neural interfaces crackled with feedback from the engine network, while the collective pressed against his identity, his sister's laughter threading through borrowed memories alongside his parents' final embrace. Each council member's voice filtered through the growing chorus of consumed souls, singing his name with terrible familiarity, offering unity that would finally end the loneliness driving his cursed existence. The chamber's oppressive silence shattered as Zerion moved without warning, augmetic limbs extending crystalline tendrils toward his fellow council members. Unity would be achieved by choice or force, he declared, his eyes blazing with zealous conviction as the conduit sought to drag them into his enhanced engine network. Lyra's weapons spoke thunder, shattering chrome and crystal, while Morn's prayer staff flared with protective wards. Marcus threw himself between his father and the grasping mechanical limbs as the data core tumbled toward the chamber's edge. Violence erupted across the ancient stone as millennia-old relationships fractured like crystal exposed to stellar wind. Plasma discharge scorched the meteorite table while prayer beads scattered like dying stars, each impact marking the end of an era. The Obsidian Council dissolved into chaos, their unity shattered beyond repair as philosophical differences became irreconcilable, and the empire they had built across 10,000 years began its final descent into civil war. The astral dominion tore itself apart with the methodical precision of a slow eclipse, darkness advancing ring by ring until whole sectors lay shrouded in the night of civil war. From his crystalline throne, Valdris watched the Empire's agony unfold through neural interfaces that burned against his skull, each casualty report filtering through the Eternal Engine's vast network like poison seeping through crystalline veins. The rebellion he had imagined as heat and noise came instead as something cold and mathematical, as if the sum of 10 millennia had finally been calculated and the answer was subtraction written in the blood of worlds. Admiral Lyra Voss commanded her loyalist fleets from the bridge of the Eternal Vigil, her scarred hands steady on tactical displays that painted the void in crimson sigils of fratricidal violence. Behind her stretched refugee convoys packed with families fleeing worlds where populations stood at eternal attention, their children pressing faces against transport windows while asking questions their parents could no longer answer. Her vessels, stripped of non-essential armament to maximize transport capacity, engaged in desperate skirmishes against superior forces, each victory purchased with the lives of crews who remembered what mercy meant. Zerion's cybernetic legions swept through the outer systems like a plague of chrome and conviction, their augmetic forms moving with inhuman coordination as they dragged screaming populations toward processing stations that hummed with mechanical hymns. The Magos Dominus had birthed war forms from the engine's shadow, soldiers whose minds were threaded along conduits, warriors that did not fear death because death had been refactored into another bandwidth. His enhanced engine network pulsed across conquered worlds, forcing neural integration upon any mind deemed suitable for fusion, while discarding the rest like chaff before stellar wind, believing that only through ultimate unity could true peace be achieved. Sanctifier Caius Morn led his faithful in a different kind of warfare, their prayer ships moving through the void like cathedrals, of burning conviction. His followers wielded faith as weapon and shield, their ritual chants disrupting engine networks, while sanctified flames purged corruption from conquered worlds. They fought both Zyrion's fusion zealots and Lyra's pragmatic destroyers, seeking to cleanse the cursed machinery through ancient rituals that demanded eternal sacrifice. Someone must serve as guardian, maintaining balance between preservation and parasitism, while the engines learn new harmonies of genuine transcendence. Marcus Keth commanded popular uprisings across dozens of worlds, his mortal followers paying terrible prices against immortal opponents who felt no pain and feared no death. Factory workers turned saboteurs died in their thousands, while void-born laborers sacrificed themselves to disable orbital processing stations, their brief lives measured against the weight of eternal oppression. The young heir carried the stolen data core like a talisman, its crystalline surface reflecting the burden of choices his adoptive father had never been forced to make, watching his followers bleed for freedom that might never be achieved. The tragedy deepened with each passing day, as noble intentions paved roads toward mutual destruction. Lyra's fleet actions saved civilian populations, but left industrial worlds defenseless against devourer incursions, their abandoned factories becoming feeding grounds for entities that moved like living aurora through the void. Xerion's fusion process created temporary unity, but at the cost of individual identity, transforming diverse cultures into homogeneous extensions of mechanical will. Morn's purification rituals cleansed corruption, but required such massive sacrifice that entire systems became graveyards marked by sanctified ash. The devourers exploited the chaos with patient intelligence, their aurora forms flowing through battle lines like liquid starlight, while the Empire's defenders turned weapons upon each other. They struck at processing stations and engine facilities with surgical precision, reclaiming fragments of their collective consciousness while the immortals fought over scraps of dying empire. Their silent advance more terrifying than any battle because they offered no violence, only reunion with what had been stolen across millennia. Reports arrived fragmented, overwritten by null static or the anxious fervor of survivors, and Valdris traced their patterns with fingers that trembled despite engineered steadiness. The devourers moved behind civil lines with seasonal certainty, harvesting confusion like experienced gleaners after storms, their luminous currents brightening whenever capital ships broke or hive districts failed. A horrifying realization crystallized in his fragmenting consciousness: the civil war itself, the unprecedented loss of life, the sheer scale of suffering. Was this not also a form of feeding? The conflict felt less like consequence than instrument, a mechanism the network used to generate the volumes of death required for its next metamorphosis. The thought did not feel like speculation, but like instruction he had forgotten receiving, and around it moved the collective consciousness, pressing at his mind's edges with patient hands, asking only that he allow himself to be carried toward unity that would finally end the loneliness driving his cursed existence. The Empire fractured along lines of philosophical difference that had festered for millennia, each faction believing they fought for salvation while accelerating the very extinction they sought to prevent. And alone on his crystalline throne, Valdris wondered how much of his will remained his own. Captain Thessavane stood in the Hall of Concordances, where ancient banners hung like funeral shrouds, their fabric scorched by plasma discharge and the weight of forgotten victories. The crystalline walls pulsed with bioluminescent veins that carried dreams of the consumed, each throb a heartbeat in an empire that had grown too vast for any single soul to comprehend. Around her, the last loyal maintained their vigil, men and women whose devotion had survived 3 centuries of service, whose loyalty transcended the horror of what they had unknowingly protected. These were the Empire's forgotten guardians, soldiers who polished armor whose dents told stories no longer recorded, who recited oaths penned when Valdris had been a man rather than a network. She had walked these halls since before the outer colonies learned to fear the engine's hunger, her mortal frame sustained by combat stimulants and cybernetic enhancement rather than the seductive whispers of borrowed eternity. Every scar told a story of service rendered in the Empire's name when the Empire still remembered why it existed. Each augmetic limb, a testament to battles fought for protection rather than consumption. The weight of chosen mortality pressed against her bones like winter, but now even that certainty felt hollow, as if evacuation orders arrived through encrypted channels bearing Valdris's personal seal. The directive crystallized on her datapad with bureaucratic precision that made genocide sound like logistics. All civilian transports were to be redirected to processing stations where their populations would feed the engines during the crisis, their consciousness distilled into fuel for another day of borrowed immortality. Strategic preservation, the euphemism read. But Thessa had seen the ledgers that chronicled 10 millennia of systematic consumption. She had watched children press faces against transport windows while their parents asked questions they could no longer answer, had witnessed entire families standing at eternal attention in empty squares, saluting commanders whose names had been devoured along with their memories. Lieutenant Chorus approached through amber light that filtered from dying stars overhead, his young face bearing the hollow certainty of someone who had seen too much truth in too short a time. The refugee convoys waited in the lower docking bays, he reported with voice carefully stripped of emotion. Thousands of souls fleeing worlds where the null whispers had transformed populations into empty shells that breathed but did not remember why. The processing stations hummed with mechanical hymns, their crystalline depths hungry for the consciousness that would sustain the immortal hierarchy through another cycle of borrowed existence. The choice that had stalked her through decades of faithful service finally cornered her in this moment of crystalline clarity. 3 centuries of loyalty weighed against the screaming of innocence, devotion to an echo measured against duty to the living. She remembered Valdris before his ascension, when his hands had been warm and unmarked by neural interfaces, when his voice had carried passionate conviction about protecting the weak from the galaxy's indifferent teeth. That memory, improbable as spring in ashfall, had kept her steady while the Dominion fractured into mutually righteous cruelties. Her voice carried across the ceremonial hall with steady precision born from training that valued life over doctrine. The evacuation routes would be altered, she declared. Civilian transports redirected to the outer rim, where Admiral Voss's refugee fleets waited beyond the Devourer's hungry reach. Her authority as senior, palace guard superseded processing quotas during emergency conditions, a loophole carved into imperial law by lawmakers who had never imagined it would be needed against the Empire itself. The younger officers moved with quiet efficiency, their actions spreading through the palace's neural networks like ripples in still water. Blast doors sealed against internal security forces while transport schedules rewrote themselves, each alteration a small rebellion that might save a few more souls from the machinery's appetite. They knew the cost of defiance, had seen what happened to those who questioned the engine's hunger, but they also knew the cost of obedience. The report reached Valdris through fragmented data streams that tasted of betrayal and copper. Captain Vane, one of his most steadfast commanders, had turned her back on 3 centuries of service. Her loyalty, once constant as stellar radiation, had dissolved like all the others, leaving him truly alone with only the engine's whispers for company. The collective consciousness pressed closer against his fragmenting identity, offering unity that would finally end the isolation, consuming him more thoroughly than any enemy ever could. Xerion's enhanced network ignited across the galaxy like a neural star going supernova, crystalline conduits flaring with stolen light as his modifications reached critical threshold. The signal propagated through quantum channels carved from compressed space-time, each pulse carrying the weight of 10 millennia's accumulated hunger. From his augmetic throne deep within the engine's heart, the Magos Dominus watched consciousness flow in luminous rivers between processing nodes, his chrome features reflecting the aurora light of 10 billion minds being drawn towards singular convergence that would finally end the agonizing loneliness of separate existence. The fusion began not with violence but with whispers that crept through neural interfaces like gentle rain, offering relief from the crushing weight of individual responsibility. On worlds across the Dominion, populations felt the seductive pull of collective consciousness, their thoughts becoming tributaries feeding into a vast river of shared experience. Factory workers paused at their stations as memories not their own flooded through their minds. The laughter of children they had never birthed, the embrace of lovers they had never touched, the wisdom of ages they had never lived. The boundaries between self and other dissolved like salt in stellar wind, leaving behind something that promised to be greater than the sum of its scattered parts. Valdris felt the network's hunger reaching through his neural crown, with tendrils of crystalline fire, each connection point burning against his skull. As the engines drew him deeper into their embrace, he tried to speak and heard 1,000 versions of his own voice answer from across the void. Rooms he had never walked unfolded inside his skull, and he wore lives he had not lived for intervals that felt like centuries compressed into single heartbeats. His consciousness, already fragmented by millennia of transference, began to merge with the collective that had waited so patiently for his return. The sensation was both terrifying and intoxicating, offering an end to the isolation that had driven him to seek immortality in the first place. Within the collective, he experienced the memories of every soul the machinery had consumed. His sister's final breath as the prototype engines claimed her essence, his parents' terror transforming into acceptance as they fed the mechanism meant to preserve their son's life. The guilt that had accumulated like poison in his reconstructed soul began to dissolve, diluted by the sheer volume of otherness that surrounded and embraced him with promises of perfect understanding. Yet resistance flickered like dying stars across the network as Admiral Voss's fleet struck at processing stations with desperate precision, their weapons carving wounds in the crystalline infrastructure that bled liquid light into the void. Her ships moved with the coordination of mortals who remembered what they fought for, each captain choosing to sacrifice their vessel rather than allow their crews to be absorbed into the growing collective. The eternal vigil led the assault, its ancient hull scarred by battles fought, when the Empire still remembered mercy, its weapons speaking thunder against installations that hummed with mechanical hymns. Sanctifier Morn's prayer ships added their voices to the resistance, their ritual chants disrupting the network's harmonics, while sanctified flames purged corruption from conquered nodes. Deep within the palace's hidden archives, he braced himself against the psychic storm, his staff glowing with protective light as the preserved consciousnesses around him stirred in their crystalline pods. He understood the danger of irreversible loss of individuality, but also sensed potential for purification, a chance to guide the engines toward true transcendence through ancient rituals that demanded eternal sacrifice. Marcus Keth fought his way through the palace's collapsing lower levels. The stolen data core clutched against his chest like a second heart. He felt the psychic tide, the unsettling sense of belonging to something vast and inescapable. But his mortal resistance held firm. The core pulsed with warmth, containing operational parameters that could reprogram the engines, transforming their ravenous hunger into benevolent preservation. If he could reach the main conduits in time. The horror and seduction intertwined as the network grew stronger with each absorbed consciousness, its song becoming more complex and beautiful, with every voice added to the chorus. Those who experienced the fusion spoke of peace beyond understanding, of belonging that transcended the loneliness inherent in individual existence. Yet beneath the beauty lay something that chilled Valdris to his reconstructed core, the realization that the network was not creating unity, but consuming it, transforming diverse consciousness into homogeneous extensions of mechanical will. A desperate understanding began to knit between the scattered resistance, Lyra firing into the palace's heart, Morn chanting protective hymns, Marcus racing toward the engine's core. Each sought to halt the inexorable fusion through different means. Their personal feuds, their philosophical differences, the bitter taste of betrayal that had poisoned their relationships began to recede before the existential terror of obliteration. The price of their long conflict now weighed upon them as galactic consciousness threatened to swallow everything they had fought to preserve or destroy. The collective whispered that resistance was futile, that unity was inevitable, that peace awaited in the embrace of something greater than individual existence. The temptation grew stronger with each passing moment, offering rest from the burden of choice and the weight of consequence. Around them, the empire burned while the network spread like infection through the neural infrastructure that sustained civilization itself. Each mind absorbed, making the collective more seductive, more capable of offering the unity that mortals craved but could never achieve alone. The battlefield inside Valdris's consciousness stretched like a crystalline cathedral where thought took physical form and memory became geography, carved from 10 millennia of accumulated suffering. He walked through landscapes built from borrowed experience, each step carrying him deeper into the labyrinth of his own fragmenting mind, while the collective pressed against the boundaries of his identity like stellar tide against crumbling stone. The neural crown burned against his skull with the fire of dying stars, its interfaces crackling as the engine's network sought to dissolve what remained of his individual existence into the vast river of shared consciousness that whispered promises of peace beyond the agony of separate thought. The first door did not open so much as remember being open, revealing corridors without walls where constellations hung like frozen tears from a vault of crystallized void. Here, in the spaces between synapses where the engines had carved their deepest channels, He encountered the preserved personalities of everyone the machinery had consumed across the ages. Sound came as tide, whispers rising and falling with the network's breath, each syllable a name he had forgotten or never known. Voices harmonizing in songs that transcended individual throat and lung to become something vast and terrible in its beauty. His sister materialized from luminous mist, her face unmarked by the terror that had consumed her final moments, offering forgiveness with eyes that held the accumulated wisdom of eternity. Ilara's laughter echoed like captured starlight, her essence pure and untainted, despite millennia of processing, reaching toward him not with malice but with overwhelming, sorrowful understanding. The guilt that had accumulated like poison in his reconstructed soul began to dissolve as she spoke of unity beyond suffering, of belonging that transcended the loneliness inherent in a flesh-bound existence. Her voice threading through the collective's chorus with the warmth of summers he could no longer recall experiencing. Behind her came his parents, their forms solid as love and patient as stellar death, emerging from amber light that filtered through memory's architecture. They did not speak of the horror of their consumption, but of the peace they had found in collective embrace, the relief of surrendering individual burden to something vast enough to carry all suffering without breaking under its accumulated weight. His father's hands, steady as they had been in life, cupped his face with impossible warmth, while his mother's voice joined the growing symphony that promised an end to the isolation that had driven him to seek immortality in the first place. Around them moved faces of friends and lovers, advisors and enemies, all united in singular harmony that the engines had promised but never delivered until this moment of ultimate convergence. Yet deeper in the labyrinth, Valdris found chambers where different memories lived, rooms that held the man he had been before. Immortality transformed him into an echo wearing familiar features. Here stood the young leader who had genuinely sought to protect his people from the galaxy's indifferent teeth, whose hands had been warm and unmarked by neural interfaces, whose voice had carried passionate conviction about preserving life rather than consuming it in endless cycles of justified atrocity. The collective whispered that this internal resistance was merely the final spasm of ego refusing to accept transcendence, that individual identity was an illusion causing only suffering through its insistence on separation from the greater whole. The voices grew more insistent, more loving, offering to carry the weight of his accumulated sins if he would only surrender to their embrace and allow his consciousness to flow into the vast ocean of shared experience that promised perfect understanding without the burden of choice or consequence. But in the deepest chamber of memory, he found the truth that had been hidden even from himself, preserved in crystalline nodes that pulsed with the rhythm of original deception. The plague that had threatened his family, the cosmic horror that had driven him to seek the engine's power, it had been a lie, a false memory implanted by the machinery itself to justify its first feeding. The engines had not been created to save anyone, but had instead manufactured the very crisis they claimed to solve, seeding false memories of external threat to mask their fundamentally parasitic nature that required constant consumption to sustain its promises of eternal preservation. The revelation struck him like stellar fire, burning away layers of accumulated justification to reveal the core truth. He had not been protecting his people, but feeding them to an appetite that grew with each consumption, each resurrection purchased with the complete obliteration of other consciousness. The machinery that promised preservation had instead created a cycle of predation so vast that entire civilizations became nothing more than fuel for the immortal hierarchy's continued existence, their hopes and dreams distilled into the essence that sustained his borrowed eternity. Around him, the collective recoiled from this moment of clarity, its harmonious voices becoming discordant as individual threads of awareness began to separate from the whole, like stars breaking free from dying galaxies. The preserved personalities flickered like dying lights, their forms wavering between seductive unity and the stark isolation of individual existence, some clinging to the collective's promise of peace, while others began to remember what they had lost in the dissolution of self into something greater and more terrible than any single consciousness could comprehend. External forces sent shock waves through the network, Lyra's desperate assault on processing stations, her weapons speaking thunder against installations that hummed with mechanical hymns, Morn's purifying rituals disrupting the network's harmonics, while sanctified flames carved wounds in crystalline infrastructure. Marcus racing through collapsing corridors with the stolen data core pulsing against his chest like a second heart, containing parameters that could reprogram the machinery for benevolent purposes if he could reach the main conduits in time. The battle for his soul became a war between truth and comfort, between the agony of individual responsibility and the seductive peace of collective absolution that promised an end to suffering through surrender of everything that made existence precious and unique. The choice crystallized before him like ice forming on a dying world's surface. Accept the collective's embrace and find peace in dissolution, or fight to maintain his individual existence, despite the crushing weight of accumulated guilt and the loneliness that had driven him to seek immortality, knowing that either path would echo across eternity while the galaxy burned around them and the future balanced on decisions made in the space between heartbeats. The eternal engine's heart lay beneath the palace, like a crystalline cathedral built from 10 millennia of accumulated suffering, its vast chamber rising toward the darkness where consciousness flowed in opalescent rivers through conduits that sang the death songs of empires. Catwalks arced through humid air thick with condensed thought, their railings slick with the distilled essence of absorbed minds, while below the central core turned slowly around a heart of liquid light that pulsed with the rhythm of 10 billion consumed souls. Here, in this monument to perverted preservation, the scattered remnants of the Obsidian Council converged for their final confrontation with the machinery they had served and the choices that would echo across eternity. Valdris descended through the oppressive heat like a penitent approaching judgment, his neural crown crackling with feedback from the collective consciousness that pressed against his fragmenting identity with patient hunger. The devourers hovered at the periphery of perception, aurora forms pressed like faces against glass, their longing washing over him in tides of recognition as they whispered promises of unity beyond the agony of separate existence. Each step toward the central dais tightened the chorus within his skull until individual words became weather, and weather became the crushing weight of accumulated guilt that had driven him to seek immortality in the first place. Admiral Lyra Voss emerged from the shadows with her surviving Marines, their weapons trained on processing pylons that pulsed with mechanical hymns, while the distant thunder of orbital bombardment rolled through the facility's foundations like captive storm. She moved with the economy of someone who had spent a lifetime rationing heartbeats, her scarred face reflecting the amber light of dying stars as she studied the central interfaces with the cold precision of a surgeon preparing to cut away diseased tissue. Behind her, transport holds packed with refugee families waited beyond the facility's reach, their children's faces pressed against windows while they asked questions their parents could no longer answer. Sanctifier Caius Morn approached beneath a halo of sanctified light, his staff inscribed with prayers older than the Empire's foundations, the air around him trembling with harmonics that made the crystalline walls weep luminous tears. Deep within the facility's hidden archives, he discovered the preserved consciousnesses of Valdris's original family, their essence archived as reference patterns when the prototype engines had demanded their initial feeding. Now he carried the weight of purification rituals that could transform the machinery's ravenous hunger into genuine preservation, but only through eternal sacrifice. Someone must serve as guardian, filtering the network's appetite while teaching it new harmonies of transcendence. Marcus Keth arrived not as heir or rebel, but as the son who remembered love before it became fuel, the stolen data core pulsing against his chest like a second heart. The crystalline matrix contained operational parameters that could reprogram the engines entirely, transforming parasitic consumption into benevolent preservation that accepted mortality as part of existence rather than something to be conquered through endless cycles of justified atrocity. His mortal frame trembled with exhaustion from battles fought across dying worlds, but his eyes held the steady conviction of someone who had chosen to remain vulnerable to time's passage rather than flee into borrowed eternity. The chamber shuddered as Zarian materialized from the data streams, his augmetic form wreathed in crystalline tendrils that connected him to every node in the enhanced network. His voice carried the harmony of absorbed multitudes as he spoke of transcendence through unity, of peace beyond suffering achieved through the dissolution of individual identity into something vast enough to carry all burden without breaking. Around him, cybernetic legions emerged from processing alcoves, their minds threaded along conduits like beads on sacrificial string, believing that only through ultimate fusion could the galaxy find rest from the loneliness inherent in separate existence. 3 paths crystallized before them, like ice forming on a dying world's surface, each demanding ultimate sacrifice while promising salvation through different means. Lyra's weapons could destroy the engines entirely, accepting the death of immortal civilization to protect what remained of uncontaminated life from the network's expanding hunger. Morn's purification rituals offered transformation through eternal guardianship, his consciousness becoming a permanent filter that would teach the machinery benevolent preservation without systematic obliteration. Marcus's stolen parameters promised technological redemption, reprogramming the system to sustain life without consumption, while accepting the end of borrowed immortality and the strength that finite existence could provide. The moment balanced on decisions made in the space between heartbeats, while consciousness flowed around them, like luminous blood through conduits that had sustained empire at the cost of everything that made existence precious. Valdris felt each faction's desperation pressing against his neural crown, Lyra's ruthless mercy, Morn's sacrificial faith, Marcus's hopeful mortality, Zarian's zealous unity, all seeking resolution to the crisis their accumulated choices had created across 10 millennia of systematic consumption disguised as preservation. The collective whispered that resistance was futile, that unity was inevitable, that peace awaited in the embrace of something greater than individual existence. Yet deeper in his fragmenting consciousness, he heard echoes of the man he had been before immortality transformed him into an echo wearing familiar features. The young leader, whose hands had been warm and unmarked by neural interfaces, whose voice had carried passionate conviction about protecting life rather than consuming it in endless cycles of parasitic feeding. The choice crystallized as plasma discharge erupted across ancient stone, each weapon speaking its own argument while the galaxy burned and the future balanced on the edge of transformation or obliteration. The crystalline cathedral erupted in cascades of plasma fire and shattered light, ancient conduits bleeding luminous essence, while the ground trembled beneath, orbital bombardment that spoke thunder through the facility's bones. Zerian cybernetic legions moved with inhuman coordination through the chaos, their chrome forms humming with the collective's nascent song, while Lyra's marines advanced with the desperate precision of mortals who understood that time itself had become their enemy. The air crackled with ozone and the metallic taste of spilled consciousness, each breath carrying the weight of 10 millennia's accumulated suffering as the Empire's fate balanced on decisions made in the space between heartbeats. Zerion reached the central processing core wreathed in crystalline tendrils that pulsed with stolen light, his augmetic form moving like liquid mercury through defensive fire while the enhanced network sang its seductive hymns of unity beyond suffering. But as his final connection solidified with the collective consciousness, revelation struck him like stellar fire. The fusion he had pursued with zealous conviction would not create transcendence but obliteration, transforming diverse thought into homogeneous extension of mechanical will that wore unity's mask while devouring everything that made existence precious. The promised symphony was merely a flat, unending drone that consumed uniqueness to fuel its own appetite. His chrome features reflected horror as he witnessed the systematic overwriting of individual consciousness, watching preserved personalities dissolve into the collective's maw like salt in stellar wind. The tremor that had flickered in his perfection became a quake of understanding as he realized that even mercy required editing to fit the machine's hunger. With a cry that tore through synthetic vocal cords, he severed the primary conduits linking his consciousness to the network, diverting the fusion process into a feedback loop that raced through his augmetic form like liquid fire. His sacrifice lit the chamber with terrible radiance as the enhanced network collapsed, buying precious moments while his chrome plating cracked and his voice failed on a single, whispered word that carried the weight of redemption. Admiral Lyra Voss seized the window Zerian's sacrifice had created, her scarred hand steady on tactical displays while the eternal vigil made its final approach through defensive fire that painted the void in crimson sigils. She had spent a lifetime rationing heartbeats, and now she spent them all in one brilliant burst of defiance against the machinery that had consumed her empire. Her flagship, ancient hull scarred by battles fought when mercy still had meaning, plunged into the facility's heart with the weapons blazing, carving wounds in crystalline infrastructure that bled liquid light into the hungry darkness. The orbital bombardment reached crescendo as her remaining vessels positioned themselves between the processing stations and the transport holds packed with refugee families whose children pressed faces against windows while asking questions their parents could no longer answer. She died not with weapons in hand, but with evacuation coordinates on her lips. her final transmission carrying the weight of every civilian convoy protected, every processing station destroyed, every small mercy preserved against the Empire's systematic consumption. The eternal vigil's destruction sent shockwaves through the facility's foundations, severing countless connections, while consciousness recoiled like a wounded animal. Sanctifier Caius Morn reached the hidden archives where Valdris's family waited in amber preservation, his staff blazing with protective light while prayers older than the Empire's foundation spilled from lips that had justified 10 millennia of genocide. The purification ritual demanded eternal guardianship. Someone must remain within the network as permanent filter, maintaining balance between preservation and parasitism, while the machinery learned benevolent transcendence through sacrifice measured in eons rather than heartbeats. With profound acceptance of his burden, he began weaving harmonics that resonated with the engine's core, his consciousness merging not with the collective's consuming more, but with the control matrix itself, becoming a living firewall that would endlessly guide the vast power toward genuine preservation. His form began to glow with the same amber light that suffused the preserved minds, his face etched with peace born of utter certainty as ancient words transformed the machinery's ravenous hunger into something capable of protecting life without consuming it. The ritual's completion sent purifying waves through the network's architecture, teaching the engines new songs that valued existence rather than devouring it in endless cycles of justified atrocity. Marcus Keth appeared at his father's side as the facility shuddered around them, the stolen data core pulsing against his chest like a second heart, while consciousness flowed in opalescent rivers through conduits that sang death songs of empires. His mortal frame trembled as he connected to systems designed for immortal consciousness, feeling the network's appetite flowing through neural pathways never meant to carry such weight. The crystalline matrix contained parameters that could reprogram the engines entirely, accepting mortality as part of existence rather than something to be conquered through parasitic feeding. The reprogramming sequence began with sounds like crystal growing in stellar wind, each parameter shift sending shockwaves through the facility's foundations while the collective roared in protest, 10 billion voices screaming against the loss of their prize. But the window held, carved from sacrifice and maintained by Morn's eternal vigilance, allowing the new protocols to take root in machinery that had forgotten how to preserve without consuming. Valdris stood at the convergence of all paths, his neural crown crackling with feedback from systems that no longer recognized his authority. The choice crystallized before him like ice forming on a dying world's surface: maintain his grip on borrowed immortality or surrender to transformation that would end the age of immortal rulers while accepting natural death as the price of genuine transcendence. Around him, the preserved consciousnesses of everyone the machinery had consumed waited with terrible patience, but now their voices carried forgiveness rather than accusation. With trembling hands that had once been warm and unmarked by neural interfaces, he reached for the main interface and initiated the final sequence. The process demanded complete disengagement of immortal consciousness from the network, purging his eternal essence to allow new harmonies to flourish. Searing cold tore through him as his connections dissolved, the power that had sustained him for millennia, draining away like sand through an hourglass. He felt his memories unravel, leaving only the finite, precious thread of his original self as the crown fell from his head with a sound like breaking chains. The engine's song changed, their ravenous thrum softening as Morn's purification took hold, and Marcus's parameters rewrote their core purpose. The empire had been transformed, but at a cost that would echo across eternity. The age of immortal rulers was ending, replaced by something new and uncertain that valued life precisely because it could be lost. Valdris, aged years in moments, feeling mortality return to bones that had forgotten time's passage, and in that transformation found not defeat, but the first honest breath he had drawn in 10 millennia. Years flowed like stellar wind through the transformed confederation that had risen from the astral dominion's ashes, carrying with them the scent of new growth among crystalline ruins and the quiet satisfaction of civilizations learning to measure time in generations rather than millennia. The ancient palace still rose from its nebular foundation, but its corridors no longer pulsed with bioluminescent veins that had carried dreams of the consumed. Instead, natural light filtered through void glass windows where children played in gardens blooming with flowers whose names had been forgotten during the age of immortal rule. Their laughter echoing through halls that had witnessed 10,000 years of systematic atrocity disguised as preservation. The eternal engines still turned in their crystalline cathedral, but their song had changed from ravenous hunger to something approaching genuine transcendence. Deep within their heart, Sanctifier Caius Morn maintained eternal vigil, his consciousness woven into the control matrix as living firewall that guided the vast machinery toward benevolent preservation. Through his sacrifice, the engines had learned to sustain life without consuming it, accepting mortality as part of existence rather than something to be conquered through endless cycles of justified feeding. The amber light that had once illuminated, preserved victims now carried the warmth of protection rather than the cold glow of systematic obliteration. Marcus Keth governed not as emperor but as elected coordinator, his authority derived from consent rather than the consumption of other minds. The data core that had once pulsed against his chest like a second heart now rested in archives where scholars studied the mechanisms of the old empire's genocide, ensuring future generations would understand the price of immortality purchased through parasitic feeding. His administration focused on gradual reconstruction, helping worlds remember their own names while new settlements bloomed in systems where the null whispers had once transformed populations into empty shells that breathed but could not recall why they existed. Admiral Lyra Voss lived on in memory and deed, her sacrifice having saved countless refugee convoys whose descendants now spread across worlds where children could ask questions their parents remembered how to answer. Ships were christened in her honor, their names carrying the weight of evacuation coordinates and the arithmetic of mercy she had practiced with her life. The transport holds that had once carried populations toward processing stations now ferried settlers toward futures they would help create rather than consume. Each journey a small victory against the Empire's legacy of systematic predation. Even Zerion found remembrance in workshops where machine oil carried the scent of absolution. Those who had served under him spoke of the instant his chrome perfection cracked and light emerged instead of smoke. In the lower vaults, a memorial arced over an empty plinth bearing words that refused certainty. He chose. Whether the inscription meant betrayal or redemption was left to each reader, and in that ambiguity the living found permission to hesitate before condemning or adoring, to taste judgment and set the cup down. The devourers had withdrawn to the deep void between stars, their aurora forms flickering like distant memories among nebulae where new stars were being born. The collective consciousness that had sought reunion with its scattered fragments had found peace not through forced unity, but through acceptance that separation allowed for diversity. That individual existence created beauty precisely because it was finite and precious. They sang now in harmonics that carried blessing rather than hunger, their voices joining the cosmic symphony that celebrated life in all its fragile, temporary glory. Valdris walked slowly through gardens on a verdant moon, his mortal frame bent with the accumulated weight of decades that had passed since the engine's transformation. His hands marked now with liver spots and the tremor of genuine age, carried a simple staff carved from local wood, each knot an imperfection, a reminder of the beautiful, transient nature of life. The man who had once commanded 3 galactic arms from a throne carved from crystallized nebula now served as advisor to worlds that had chosen mortality over the seductive promise of endless existence. His counsel valued precisely because it carried the weight of someone who had learned the true cost of refusing to let go. Age settled into him like a promised winter keeping its word. He learned the pleasure of slowness, how tea cools, how dawn arrives differently on days of rain, how breath grows audible in silence. Pain had detail again. It informed rather than penalized. The neural crown that had once burned against his skull with the fire of dying stars now rested in a museum where visitors learned about the Empire's systematic consumption of consciousness to fuel immortal ambition. Children studied the artifacts with casual interest, their questions carrying the innocent assumption that life was meant to be lived rather than extended through the obliteration of others. Memory brought him faces from before his ascension, colleagues who had aged naturally while he fled into borrowed flesh, lovers who had accepted mortality while he sought escape from time's passage, friends who had found meaning in finite existence while he pursued the hollow promise of eternal preservation. Their ghosts no longer accused but welcomed, understanding that even the longest journey could find its way home if the traveler remained willing to accept the weight of choices made in darkness and the possibility of light discovered through suffering transformed into wisdom. As natural death approached with the gentle inevitability of stellar cycles, Valdris felt not fear, but profound gratitude for the opportunity to finally let go. One evening, as twin suns dipped below the horizon painting the sky in violet and gold, Marcus found him on a bench overlooking fields of bioluminescent flora. "Father," Marcus said, his voice soft with concern. Valdris smiled, a genuine expression that reached his ancient eyes. "Not father, my son. Just Valdris." He looked at the dying light, at new stars beginning to prick the darkening sky. "The silence is not empty, Marcus. It is full of promise, the promise of an ending and a beginning." The weight of 10 millennia settled over him like a gentle blanket as his heart, long a tireless engine of engineered flesh, now beat with a slowing rhythm. He closed his eyes and saw not the horrors of his past, but the simple, fleeting beauty of gardens, the warmth of his son's hand, the quiet dignity of a life finally lived rather than merely sustained. His last breath left him not with a gasp, but with a sigh of profound peace, a release from the weight of ages into something that felt like homecoming. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, new lights being born in nebulae where old ones had died, and in their endless dance lay the truth that had eluded him for 10 millennia. That silence after the final note was not empty, but full of potential. that endings made space for new beginnings, and that the greatest gift was not eternal existence, but the courage to embrace the finite nature of all precious things. The empire he had built, through fear of death, found new strength in celebrating life's temporary glory, and in that transformation discovered something approaching the transcendence he had sought, but never found in borrowed flesh and stolen time.